to that, who do you show up as? How do you know the person that you should be?
We talk a lot about authenticity in business, don't we? You hear this all the time. People say, right, as a leader, you should be yourself. You should show up and be authentic. And I have a slightly different view on that. I think it's okay to have a persona because you're bringing that persona to create harm, and you're bringing that persona to bring clarity and to make sure that people understand the nature of the change. That may well not be how you are feeling on that day. And if you are really truly authentic with a capital A, you might turn up in that conversation pulling your hair out or looking stressed. But we're not advocating for that. We're not saying you should show up like that. So I think it's a bit of a myth to say turn up and be authentic. I think you have to curate and create the personas for the situation that you're dealing with, and that is for your people.
This episode is brought to you by Instant Impact. Instant Impact provides transformative talent solutions to small and mid-sized companies that are making between 30 and 500 hires each year. If your recruitment's giving you a headache and you don't know where to start, then give the team at Instant Impact a call or visit www.instant-impact.com for more information.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About HR. I'm your host, Felix Mitchell. There are huge forces shaping our businesses and our lives today. Companies have been forced to adopt new working practices, technologies, and operating models at a rate of knots, and there seems like there are no signs of it slowing down. And we talk a lot on this show about how executives can lead their teams through change, transparency, culture, empathy. But what are the impacts that these times are having on the leaders themselves? Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by the awesome Jo Matkin. Jo's seen this from all angles. She's been chief exec 3 times for 3 very different companies, ranging from private equity backed to bootstrapped and founder led. She's also held leadership roles at 2 different membership organizations, Talent and SIA, bringing her into close contact with hundreds of leaders managing through challenging times. Jo, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, does this period of change feel different to others you've seen?
It does. And I think it feels different because we're all in it together. We're going through some massive technological change. You can't walk 5 minutes down the street without tripping over somebody talking about AI. It's just what we talk about all of the time. I hope this conversation won't be focused just on that. And the last time that I think we were all in it together when it came to change was in the period of COVID-19. And so I think that does have some kind of positive to it, because it means that leaders feel like they're not managing change in a bubble, in isolation. It's something that the whole world is going through. And I think there's some shades of that here now. But business doesn't stop when macro trends are happening and when change is happening outside. And you've still got to grow your organization. You've still got to manage and lead your people. You've still got to transform. And so what we're trying to navigate now is managing this kind of mega change out here with continuing to manage probably the more mundane, but arguably more impactful change in your own organization.
Yeah, and it does feel like, no matter how many conversations we have around how cool the tech is or how innovative the solution is, it always feels like it comes down to how carefully thought through, well managed is the change program that sits at the core of it, the comms, the process, the step-by-step, milestone-by-milestone approach.
Absolutely, and that's obviously the backbone of any transformational change, either inside your organisation or on a more broad scale. But when we spoke a few weeks ago, the thing that we were diving into, if you recall, was there's a playbook, right, for managing change, and you've just run through some of the points on that playbook. But that's very much around how you execute change, and it's more the steps. What you never really get the insights into as a leader and as a CEO is, how is this process going to make me feel? What's the impact on me as an individual and as a leader? And therefore, who am I showing up as? And what's the impact on the teams that I'm leading, particularly if it's through a particularly challenging change that might have a negative impact on staff members. It might have, it might affect people's lives, people's careers, that type of thing.
And one of the things that does feel unique to me about this, granted, I think COVID, when we're getting so unique, just feels like such an outlier that
Right.
we kind of leave it to the side. But the thing that does feel different is the volume of businesses, the proportion of businesses that have an operating model change on the horizon. I read a report by McKinsey saying that, I mean, even now, despite the fact that we're talking relatively early adoption of AI and all of the technology that comes along with that. So we're talking 12, 15% adoption of AI to the actual implementation, compared to 40% of CEOs who believe they're going to need a full operating model shift, which is just because of AI. Forget the other reasons.
Yes.
So this feels like a present and pretty pervasive issue that the businesses are going to have to deal with. And when we talk about operating model shift, we are often talking about people losing their jobs to offshoring or technology, or losing market share, or whatever that looks like. So onto that, who do you show up as? How do you know? How do you know the person that you should be?
Right. Well, I think it depends on who your audience is. So we talk a lot about authenticity in business, don't we? You hear this all the time. People say, right, as a leader, you should be yourself. You should show up and be authentic. And I have a slightly different view on that. I think it's okay to have a persona in certain conversations and with certain parts of your organization and outside, because you're bringing that persona to create calm, and you're bringing that persona to bring clarity and to make sure that people understand the nature of the change. That may well not be how you are feeling on that day. And if you are really truly authentic with a capital A, you might turn up in that conversation pulling your hair out or looking stressed, or maybe you feel tearful. That does happen to CEOs too. But we're not advocating for that. We're not saying you should show up like that. So I think it's a bit of a myth to say turn up and be authentic. I think you have to curate and create the personas for the situation that you're dealing with, and that is for your people.
You sort of have to pick the authentic version of yourself, right, for the moment.
Yeah. And you're being true to yourself when you're, so I suppose the question is, when do you have those moments, right? Because you can't have them in front of your team, because you owe it to your team to be clear and show direction of travel. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an impact on you as a leader in managing some really, really tough change. So one of the things that we've spoken about recently as well is, who is your tribe in that situation? Who are you going to go to if you need to vent or have a tough day? And it probably, unless you've got an incredibly tight organization and an exceptional executive team, it probably isn't your executive team. Mm-hmm. It might be your outside community. It might be your family. It might be, and it might need to be, a network and a group of trusted individuals that you've created specifically for that purpose. And a couple of, 2 or 3 years ago when I was in a fairly, managing some fairly challenging transformation, an ex-colleague and I created something that we called our virtual board. So there was no structure to that. There was no structure to, it wasn't a board in the truest sense of the word, but we were two people, two leaders, managing some challenging change in our own individual organisations. And we would make a point of coming together for conversations just to talk about that. Nothing confidential, but just talking about how does that make me feel? Like, how am I showing up? What am I, how am I being here for my team and managing the change in that way?
I think that's so valuable. I'm sure having your tribe of supports, everyone can learn from that. You don't need to be leading a business. Let's take it back though. For those that haven't led businesses through change, through challenging times, how does it feel to a leader? How did it feel to you when you've done that previously?
I think there's two sides to it. So there's the practical, logical side of, we have a strategy to deliver. We know we need to execute on this change. It's a needs must situation. And to your point around AI, there may be a clear and present danger that you have to overcome. So I think the part one is equipping yourself with knowledge and information, making sure that you have the right talent around you, because it always comes down to talent. So one of the things that I learned when I was a first-time CEO, and again, I'm sure you've heard this many times in some of the conversations you've had, is really putting some effort into learning the difference between the things that you should be doing and that you should be setting direction of travel on, and finding the talent to do that for you. So having a plan is one thing, but you don't need to be the person executing on that plan. You do need to make sure you've got incredible people around you who can execute on that. So that's part one in terms of the practicalities. But your question was, how does it feel? And I'm going to be really honest here, because I think actually other CEOs need to hear this, because I hope they'll go, oh, it's not just me. Sleepless nights, anxiety, being a bit paranoid. What's the business saying about what we're doing? What does the board think? What does the private equity think? Have I got this right? Are my instincts on or off? If somebody's got a different opinion to me, does that mean I'm wrong? Does it mean they're wrong? Are we both wrong? So I think, I certainly, and we have this inner monologue that's running all of the time. And I think part of that showing up in a transformational situation and leading the charge on it is knowing how and when to dial down that monologue, but also when to listen to it. Because sometimes in the sort of that thought process of, what do they think? What do they think? What do I think? Yes, you get some real clarity if you just let it in.
Because at the end of the day, it's trying to tell you something. And sometimes it's trying to tell you something at an inappropriate volume or an inappropriate time of the night, or, when you're trying to focus on something else. But there is a reason that you're hearing that you're hearing your own voice. Because I really empathize with what you're saying, which is, there are always questions, but you're the person that's also supposed to have the answers.
Well, are you?
Interesting.
Because I think that's the game with two halves as well, which is, yes, you are supposed to have most of the answers, but nobody's superhuman. You don't have all the answers. So I would challenge that slightly and say, yes, you need to have answers, but if you don't, you need to know where to go and find them.
Yeah. So I think this actually brings us quite neatly onto, so you've got this in a monologue. You have your doubts, you have your concerns, your fears, you have your sleepless nights, you have your teary moments. You have some of the answers, but not all of the answers. Now, there's a generally accepted wisdom that being a vulnerable leader and a transparent leader is important. But where do you pick the lines where you say, how much of this can I share with my business?
Yeah.
I mean, I would imagine on one end of the extreme, you certainly don't want to be laying out your strategy and that your team is listening to and saying, right, Joe's got a plan to get us through this. Joe and the team have a plan to get us through this. Sure, there are some things that you'd add an answer for, but
yeah,
that's the rough direction. Yeah. At the end of that meeting where you've just put all of that forward, you probably don't want to be like, well, of course, I woke up in the middle of last night, or it might all be completely wrong. So probably on that end of the spectrum, you don't want to do that. And then to your point earlier, you probably don't want to be the person saying, look, I've got all the ideas. This is what we did. So how do you choose which bits to filter through to the business? Let's say, you've got some plans that you're working on, but they're not fully cooked yet. When do you share those thoughts with the organization? Or how do you pick and choose the right message to filter through?
What I've learned is that those opportunities and those moments find you. So if we just dive into that topic of vulnerability, as I said before, there's certain things that, for the good of the business, you don't share. However, I think one of the things that I found really powerful in probably my last 5 or 6 leadership roles is just never underestimate the power of having a conversation with an up-and-coming leader who is a little bit out of their comfort zone and feeling nervous, and just saying, I feel like that too sometimes.
Brilliant.
Or I felt like that in your position. And did you know that I was up last night thinking about this? And 9 times out of 10, they'll go, really?
Yeah.
It's a surprise, but the feedback I almost universally have got if I've had those conversations, and they tend to be one-to-one, and they tend to be out of context because it'll be having a discussion about something else, and you just find your moment to show up in that way. 9 times out of 10, the response you'll get is, I never thought that leaders were like, I thought they were impenetrable and vulnerable. They're vulnerable rather. And also that makes me feel so much better. So I think it's a bit of a gift actually, because I think you're creating an opportunity for someone else to go, oh, it's not just me, and I'm allowed to have my moments. I don't have to be perfect. And, leaders don't just look like machines that are brilliant at absolutely everything.
So that's a conversation with other leaders. How about with...
Well, no, that's with the business.
That's with the whole business.
That's with the business. So that could be anybody. So in your world, that might be a recruiter who just wants to spend a bit of time with Felix, who wants to understand how you tick. Or perhaps you're having a mentoring session, or perhaps you're doing a town hall, or perhaps you're, engaging with your business in some way, shape or form. Moments often present themselves to have those types of conversations, even if it's just somebody asking for a bit of advice. And I think just that little window of vulnerability in those moments on a one-to-one basis is enough.
Yeah, and that's so powerful. So it's great that it sort of takes some of the pressure off looking for those moments to actually just be open to them. Yeah, hopefully they'll like.
Yeah, and you don't want to be too prescriptive, right? Because back to our point around authenticity, it would be really inauthentic to say, right, I'm going to show up and be happy on this day and not great on this day. You can't design it that way. For me, being authentic is knowing that at any time I can show my whole self. I'm not going to do that in a pre-structured fashion. But I think part of the learning as a leader is just knowing how to show those parts of yourself, and where and when, and it's more instinctive than anything else.
That's really interesting. So we're going through all of this shift. Leaders were learning, as we always do, learning on the job, making mistakes, doing all the rest of this. And so I'd love to get into a little bit more detail around creating a tribe, or actually, let's not be overly prescriptive with that one.
Okay.
How do we make sure that we are supported? How do we make sure that we have the, I guess, mental strength, physical strength to make it through these challenging phases?
One of the things that that CEOs, I guess it's, if you're in a corporate, it's one of the things you're paid for, and if you're running your own business, it's one of the things that you take on, which is psychological burden. Right. So it's almost part of the job description that's never written down, you will execute on strategy, you will make plans, you will lead your teams, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What it never says is, and you will take on the psychological burden of doing all of those things because that's your job. That's what you are there to do.
Right point.
So that's the kind of the page 2 of the job description that no one ever shares with you. And so when you realise that that's what you're being paid to take on, which is fine, you have to treat it like any other project and go, right, well, this is part of my job, so I have to protect it and look after it. So if I'm carrying a psychological burden, there's psychological impact there. And so you need to be kind of logical and proactive about how you manage that because it's part of the job. And so I think taking a sort of planned approach to how you set up the structures around you in order to manage that is a really sensible thing to do. Now, this might be different for everybody. Everyone's got their own way of doing things. As I alluded to before, the thing that I found really useful was 2 or 3 people, maybe not even in the same conversation, that I trust that are, you know, maybe have some parallel challenges that I can just talk to in that format. I personally found that worked really, really well for me. I think the other place is just being in, and again, we've talked about this before, and I think you gave me an example, if you don't mind me sharing it, of saying, oh, I didn't feel like going to this dinner.
Yeah.
Because I had a challenging week and I had some transformation to deliver and I just didn't feel like it. But you said, I went and I made myself went. And I think that's a really good example of that consciously taking on that part of your job description and saying, it's important for me to just go and be with other leaders who might be having challenges and just have an offline conversation, have a dinner, chill a little bit, have those discussions and show up as myself. You know, there's a difference between people who can go, oh, I'm just going to indulge in me and feeling rubbish tonight or whatever it might be. And those who say, no, it takes effort. It takes effort to still go to the dinner. So I think, you know, you've got my example of the virtual board. But the second thing is that it is identifying a community, and that might be a structured community like Talent Partners. You know, it might be a structured community where you're going and spending time with other leaders and not just learning from them, but talking to them, get to them on a human level. It might be a community that you create for yourself, or it might exist within your organisation. And you know, if you've got a very tight executive team, you may choose that that's the place where you're having those discussions of being a little bit more vulnerable with each other. For me, that didn't work because it was important to me. And, you know, we would be honest and share ourselves. But for me, again, I think it comes back to that. It's your duty on the job description, right? You know, you have to be the leader in the group. You know, you're all leaders, but you are ultimately the leader. And so I would probably advise against going to a super vulnerable space with your own team.
And there's also, I also feel like when it comes to those sorts of very high level but incredibly important conversations where you're seeking a bit of support, but you're also seeking external perspectives.
Right.
You've got your Solomon's paradox where it's always easier to solve other people's problems when you don't know the detail of it, you don't know the nuance. And so I agree with you. I think that's an external perspective, super important. And just to share my own, what I found valuable out of those sorts of communities, those sorts of friends, I found the more I'm able to, so people need a certain level of commercial understanding to be useful to me personally. And then I also need to trust them enough to be completely transparent with how things are going, what the challenges are, and all the rest of it. And the moment those 2 criteria in there, I'm not finding myself explaining all the time. I'm not finding myself masking what's going on. And that's where I'm able to get the sort of value out of those kinds of conversations. I wonder if you found the same in your own.
Yeah, you right, exactly. You need to set, you know, what are your criteria? And they may not be the same as your criteria, but I think those are 2 very, very good examples. Trust is one and understanding is another. They have to be able to get the context of the problem and you have to trust them to be able to be open with them. And as you were talking, I was just thinking of something else that I find really energizing, and it's and something that you can achieve in a space such as that, which is hearing someone else's problem and being able to help them with it. There's nothing greater if you're carrying your own burdens than just hearing someone else talk through a challenge that they've got and being able to make suggestions, to help, to suggest another person that they may talk to. Because I think what that does is, firstly, it reminds you it's not just you having challenges. But secondly, in being of service to somebody else, it takes you out of yourself. It's partly altruistic, but I think also that we all as humans get something really positive from just being able to help other people. So I think often in those communities, you end up chatting through things and being able to offer solutions, and there's no better feeling, and it definitely helps with whatever you're going through at any given time.
Now, I'm surprised when we're talking about all these things that you can do to make, as a leader, to make sure that you're fit and ready to make it through the psychological burden. You haven't mentioned golf. Yeah.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, well, it depends how personal we're being about me, right? Because
I think you probably generalised.
I'm generalising. I'm kind of, and truly, it's partly my personal experiences, but partly just observations of seeing how other leaders operate, right? So, but on a personal level, yes. So, bit of a combination of sport and I suppose downtime and chill. So, I think anything that requires you to have an intensive focus on one thing that isn't the thing that you're focusing on in the day job is a really healthy thing to get involved in, because it's very easy, isn't it? We're all guilty of this. Just sitting and doom scrolling on social media, or what a dreadful use of time that is. Dead time. So for me, the thing, my thing, I'm not very good at it. And I've only become interested in it in the last couple of years, but I absolutely love playing golf. I do it with my partner. We play most weekends. We go on golf holidays, and that's something that I find is incredibly helpful on a personal level, just to switch off, decompress, but also the feeling of improving at something.
Yes, obviously.
What's yours?
I think between the running the business and having the two toddlers at the moment, not a lot of time for everything else. I do, it sounds so lame, can't believe I'm this person. I do a lot of Peloton, spinning. I enjoy that.
And is there a competitive element to that?
I am the highest performing person on Peloton that I know, and that is very important to me.
Right. Well, that's authentic right there. So admitting that it's important to you. But it's a similar thing, right? Which is that same concept of I'm super focused on this thing in this moment, and it's got a competitive edge, which obviously, you enjoy. And even if in the back of your head you're ruminating on something that's going to move your business forward, you're still focused on that thing in the moment.
Yeah, and thank you for asking the question so I could get that on the record. Now I'm concerned that listeners are going to write in with their Peloton scores and I'm going to be in real trouble.
Oh, well, that might just mean that you have to raise the bar.
So, exactly right.
It gives you a new goal to aim.
Exactly right. But no, I love exercise has always been a really big part of my life, and I'm very much thinking of running the marathon next year. And I agree with you. I think having that, whatever it is, having something that you're working on, improving, something that takes all of your focus, it's just so important. And absolutely huge. And I mean, it is well documented, the need to, if you're going for a walk or a run or whatever, taking a step out of your week during the workday is just so valuable. You look at some of the highest performers in the world, there's so many of them have that as part of their daily ritual.
Yeah. It's an interesting point though. And again, I'm thinking as you're talking, because one of the things that's changed in the last 10 years, in terms of the role of a leader or the role of a CEO, is that we've just got this flood of advice, solicited and unsolicited advice, that just shows up on social media in terms of how high performers should perform. You should if you're, you should have a sport, you should have a set of goals, you should have focus on X, Y, Z, you should. And I think particularly for up and coming leaders, it's really hard to get into, that there's all the white noise of the way that you should be showing up. And it's quite difficult to remain authentic when you're being told these are the ingredients of a great leader. Yeah. And it's been reinforced on social media, on conversations like this, on LinkedIn, on my Instagram, we see it constantly. So I think part of the authenticity of you as a leader, it's really important to say, just take a step back and go, am I doing this because it's really me? Or am I doing this because it's something that I think represents brilliant leadership or managing through transformation? So I think it's really important to strike that balance between having a learning mindset and learning from what you see and from, business books and learning from sports people and all of those models for success. But I also think it's important to just remind yourself why you're doing those things. Are you doing them because you really, really get something out of it? Or are you doing them because that's how it should be? And that's what I've learned. I've learned to reject the things that are maybe in my consciousness because I feel like I ought to be doing them and go, no, that's not me. I don't have to be that person. And lean more into, does that really genuinely move me forward?
It's so interesting because part of the many weird things about being a co-CEO with Mr. Partner Rob.
Yeah, I mean, that is an unusual.
It's a very.
Have you done any investigations? Have you looked into how many other people operate that business model?
No, probably should. But the interesting thing is, like, for years we had some small pockets of friction, sometimes big pockets of friction. And 2 years ago we had a sit down. We just basically said, okay, well, what parts do you enjoy and what parts do I enjoy? How do you work day to day? How do I work day to day? And we split out these two halves of the CEO role for each other. And what it allowed us to do was, first of all, it was sort of a rejection of the typical model.
Right. You're not running through your list on a piece of paper going, we must execute on all these things. We both must because we have the title.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the other piece is really made us think around what made us good, both in terms of who we were, but then also how we operated. And it is instilled in us, and I believe in Instant Impact as well, a sort of mantra of kind of do what you have to do. We don't have a way that we expect people to get the most out of themselves. We don't really care what hours people work. We don't care. There are some elements we want people to go and see clients, be for team meetings, but super flexible in terms of how people work. But I think a lot of that came out of how do we rethink about what does the top job look like? And I think what you said really resonates with me, which is that some of the way Rob leads in a very, very different way to the way that I lead.
Right.
And he is authentic in a way that is different to the way that I'm authentic, and far from causing confusion in the organization. It means that people can gravitate towards the leader that they find the easier. And it's been cool. It's been an interesting.
I mean, that just hearing you say that may be, when you look back in 10 years, that may be one of the most defining things you did for business.
Oh, I think it will.
Because that moment of that sort of light bulb recognition of, well, why don't we just A, play to our strengths, but B, go for the things that we are really drawn to. It makes such perfect sense. And that doesn't have to be co-CEO to co-CEO, does it? I think that's division of labour and energy in any leadership team. It's really, and titles can really get in the way of this.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, what does the CEO do? What does the CFO? And obviously there's some fundamentals in jobs, right? There's some fundamentals. That's your technical skill. Why are you hired? Why are you in the role? What's your purpose there? But more broadly, there's that role of leadership. And you've got different leadership styles across executive teams. And I wonder how many executive teams really do ever take the time to sit down and look at the things that they're drawn to and they're particularly good at as a leader, and the things that the business needs, and dividing the labour up in that way. So it might be that your CFO, who's just not your sort of classic CFO profile, has got a real people focus.
Yeah.
Well, okay, great. Let's leverage that. It doesn't have to be that just because you have a technical job title that you stay in that box. It can be unusual mixes of things. And I think that's authenticity. That feels really authentic to me in an organisation.
And to the point around the psychological burden, it will lift that.
Right.
It will make it easier to carry across the exec company that we are out of time.
That went so quick.
Thank you so much for coming on. It was a fascinating conversation.
Really enjoyed it.